Oh, hello there. In this episode, we're going to be talking about those heroes in a half shell.
Whether you know them as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, one name comes to mind whenever I think of the video games: Konami. From 1989 to 2005, Konami delivered plenty of games starring the Turtles, including platform adventures, scrolling beat-em-ups, and one-on-one fighting games. I'm sure most of us have memories of at least a few of these games, so we'll be taking a brief look at all of the Konami games starring the Turtles that were released in the arcade and on home consoles.
So let's begin with the Nintendo Entertainment System.
There is no denying the iconic status of the first Turtles video game. Love it or hate it, it will always have its place. Personally, I never really connected with the game. I had friends who owned it and I played it quite a lot, but it caused more frustration than anything else. Going back to it now hasn't changed my feelings for the game. The NES had plenty of quality action platformers, and it's a shame this wasn't one of them. One of the main reasons I didn't do a top 10 of these games was my love of scrolling beat-em-ups. In my opinion, the original Turtles arcade game is one of the finest examples of the genre, and for those of you that follow this channel, it's obvious that one of the arcade games would have been my choice for number one. I remember seeing the arcade cabinet for the first time on a trip to the seaside, and it stood out like no other machine. The massive cabinet with colourful artwork on the sides, and 4 joysticks with each position matching the colour of the specific Turtle's mask. The graphics really captured the look of the cartoon, and throughout the game you would come face to face with plenty of recognisable enemies from the show. The music was memorable, the speech and sound effects were high quality, and moments like this still make me laugh today.
Who put the lights out? Who put the lights out?
The Turtles arcade game is definitely one of my favourite scrolling beat-em-ups, and it's a game that I love returning to on a regular basis. Before we move on, let's take a quick look at the second NES game, which was a port of the original arcade game. A lot of cutbacks were made due to hardware limitations, but it did retain most of the arcade game's elements and even added some extra stages. Unfortunately, the gameplay really suffers, and as a result, the game can become repetitive very quickly. In 1990, Fall of the Foot Clan was released for the Nintendo Game Boy. This was a game I owned when it came out, and at the time I absolutely loved it. You select your favourite turtle and set out on a quest to stop Krang and Shredder. The game worked in a similar way to the NES game, where each time a player loses all of their energy, they select a different turtle to take over. The gameplay is responsive, each level is challenging, and it was an impressive Game Boy game for its time. In 1992, the Turtles returned to the Game Boy in Back to the Sewers. The game is a little more open than its predecessor, allowing more exploration of each stage. The graphics and presentation saw improvements, and this is probably the best Turtles game on the platform. Radical Rescue was the third and final Turtles game released for the Game Boy, and this arrived in 1993. Rather than sticking to the formula of the previous two games, this entry leans more towards an adventure game, and this really lets it down. The graphics have seen a major improvement, but it's a shame they tried to overcomplicate things instead of delivering another quality side-scrolling action game. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3: The Manhattan Project was released in 1991 and was the follow-up to the NES port of the arcade game. This was another side-scrolling beat-em-up, and Konami did a great job in fine-tuning the gameplay and improving the presentation in this entry. Next we have our second trip to the arcade with Turtles in Time. This game built on the successful formula of the original arcade game and features new attacks and a dash ability, along with a time travel theme and plenty of new enemies to take down. Although the game is technically superior to its predecessor, I still prefer the original arcade game, but that's probably just nostalgia getting in the way. One negative point that did stick out to me was the absence of Bebop and Rocksteady. These two villains need to be in every Turtles game, but this issue was addressed in the Turtles in Time home port for the Super Nintendo. Konami made quite a few changes to the home version, and although it doesn't look quite as good as the arcade and is missing the 4-player co-op feature, most of the changes improved things. There were additional stages and changes to level design, new boss characters, and of course, Bebop and Rocksteady, this time dressed as pirates. Both the arcade and Super Nintendo versions are worth checking out, and it's definitely one of the best Turtles video games. Konami reworked many of the elements from Turtles in Time into the Mega Drive game, the HYPERSTONE HEIST. This was another fantastic scrolling beat-em-up, and one of my favourite games for the console. The early 90s saw the rise in popularity of one-on-one fighting games thanks to the likes of Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. Konami tried to capitalise on this popularity by releasing their own one-on-one fighting game starring the Turtles. Turtles Tournament Fighters hit home consoles during 1993 and 1994, with different results on each platform. The Super Nintendo game is often seen as the best version, and this is an opinion I'd have to agree with. Almost every element of the game is superior to the other versions, and although the cast of characters could have been better, the gameplay, graphics, and presentation really helped this one stand out. The Sega Mega Drive version was very different from its Super Nintendo counterpart, and suffered from poor gameplay, partly down to the limitation of the controller only having 3 buttons. When a game is released across multiple platforms from the same generation, you wouldn't expect such a big difference in quality. I'd be quite happy to go back and play the Super Nintendo game, but I'd definitely avoid the Sega Mega Drive version. There was a version of Tournament Fighters released for the NES in 1994, and for an 8-bit system, it's fairly impressive. Fighting games have never really been that good on the 8-bit systems, and I wouldn't recommend this one, but I did enjoy playing it more than the Sega Mega Drive version. After nearly 10 years without a new game, the Turtles returned in 2003, with Konami basing most of the designs on the TV show from around that time. Let's start by taking a look at the Game Boy Advance games. The first game was a standard 2D platformer which kept things basic and was thoroughly enjoyable. The presentation was impressive, with still images used for cutscenes. The gameplay was fast and responsive, with variations in playstyle including skateboarding and shoot-'em-up stages. Konami brought us an enjoyable update and returned to the classic style of the 90s Game Boy games. Battle Nexus was the sequel to the first Game Boy Advance game and arrived on the handheld console in 2004. This time the game focuses more on puzzle solving and exploration as you search for hidden items on each stage. One of these hidden items is your weapon, which of course means you don't start with one. Having to find your weapon feels like an unnecessary task and one which soon became annoying. It's not a terrible game, but it was disappointing when compared to the previous entry. Next we move on to the game released in 2003 for the PS2, Gamecube, Xbox and PC. This game was also based on the TV series from around that time and was an attempt to capture the feeling of the classic arcade game in a 3D environment. Up to 2 players can take part in the game as they battle through stages that are based on episodes from the TV series. Unfortunately, beyond the quality cel-shaded presentation, it's a very bland and shallow experience and lacked the polish needed to make it an enjoyable 3D beat-em-up. The console version of Battle Nexus was another 3D beat-em-up, bringing the game even closer to the arcade original by adding 4-player co-op. The game is an improvement over the previous entry, but it still fails to deliver. The repetitive gameplay and poor enemy AI make Battle Nexus a very forgettable game. Mutant Nightmare was the third console game of this era, and was released for the PS2, Gamecube and Xbox, with a version also released for the Nintendo DS. The game is another 3D beat-em-up which focuses on teamwork, as each character has specific abilities that may be needed to advance in certain sections. This feature really adds nothing to the game, with even the character progression system being a negative element of the game. There really wasn't a need to draw this series out with a third game, and Konami should have finished with Battle Nexus. The final game we'll be taking a look at is Mutant Melee, which arrived on the PS2, Gamecube, Xbox and PC in 2005. This was an arena brawler that I would very loosely compare to Capcom's Power Stone, and if Konami had put some more thought into it, this could have been amazing. Unfortunately, the game is a real mess, with dull arenas, poor combat, and an awful character lineup. I often found myself just running around and mashing buttons without a clear view of what was happening on screen. It's a real shame that this game wasn't better. Konami could have ended their time with the license with something special, and it's unfortunate that they couldn't recapture some of that magic from the early 90s. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember to let me know your thoughts in the comments section below and subscribe to the channel for future content.